Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us because today you're in for a treat as we're going to have the opportunity to hear lager tips and techniques from none other than Sierra Nevada's brewmaster, Scott Jennings. We're going to experience a guided tasting of 4 different, very unique lagers and hear what's involved in brewing a Gold World Beer Cup lager. Now, if you don't have time today to watch the entire event, you can still submit your questions and come back and watch the replay. How about sharing, though, there in the chat where you're viewing it from? I'd love to see what city and state that you're viewing is from, or if you're outside the USA, it would be fantastic just to let us know what city and country that you're from. We also have a poll down at the bottom. Scott's going to use that to kind of guide where we spend most of our time. The question is, kind of what are the things that are the biggest questions for lager fermentation so far? Choosing the best fermentation, temperature, timing, and pitch rate is kind of leading by far. So if your thoughts are a little different than that, please join our poll. So let's get right into this and meet Scott Jennings. So Scott is the brewmaster at Sierra Nevada Brewery. He joined Sierra Nevada in 2001 after apprenticeships with Young & Co.'s Brewery PLC, the Ram Brewery in London. He holds a brewmaster's diploma from the prestigious Brewing Institute, VLB Berlin. He's the brewmaster at Sierra Nevada, Asheville, North Carolina's brewery. And when he's not brewing beer, he enjoys cycling and motorcycles. So welcome, Scott. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time, as you know.
Yeah, same here, Doug. We've been trying to put this together for some time now. So it's exciting to be here. I'm very glad to be a chance to talk to everybody about lager brewing.
Well, too many of these folks hear from me all the time, but they rarely get a chance to hear from you, a master brewer. So give me about a 30-second synopsis of what they're going to hear today.
Well, we're going to taste a few beers. I hope that some of you out there have one or two of the selection that we're going to try here today. We're going to talk through a little bit about the nuances of those beers. What are the characteristics? How are those arrived at in the brewing process? We are going to talk a little bit about, I think, a very little bit about all aspects of the process. We don't have as much time as we need to really cover the nuts and bolts of everything, but we'll do a high level view of most of it. And I'd also just like to throw out there that I'm here to answer your questions. So please throw those out there as we go. And, we'll try and steer the conversation appropriately and cover as much as we can with the time that we have.
Well, excellent. I wanted to share, I know that you've got a lot of fans out there. So I was going to show you on my phone right quick. There's a group of your fan club right down there at Burning Blush. My screen will stay lit there. So a lot of folks anxious to hear this. I imagine there's some other folks there that are all set up to go. All right.
Great. Cheers, Steve and co down there at Burning Blush. I hope you're enjoying some good beers while we're going through this.
Well, Scott, I can't wait to hear more. But before we jump into the whole program, there's a couple of quick logistical items I'd like to go through. Now, if the webinar is not playing correctly, please just refresh your browser. That fixes it almost every time. And by the way, Google Chrome tends to work the very best with this particular platform. Also, if you've got internet challenges, and who doesn't right now during this crisis, in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a little gear symbol you can click on, and you can reduce the resolution, which will require much less bandwidth and let you continue the program. We also These webinars are supported through the generosity of our patrons. These are folks that support gourmet brewing and these kinds of events because there are some very real costs associated with doing this. Now, while Scott volunteers his time and I volunteer mine, there's some direct out-of-pocket expenses. So you can support these programs for as little as $1. So please consider that sometime so future webinars can continue. Everybody that registers will get an email with a link to the recording previous webinars and links to the BJCP study groups. So Scott, I am really anxious to learn more about lagers. I find lagers to be maybe one of the most challenging beers, not only to brew, but to really taste and experience a lager's unique nuances. So can you share from a brewer's point of view some of the unique aspects of brewing and experiencing lagers?
Yeah. A lot of brewers consider, the quest to produce a really world-class Pilsner, for example, or a Helles, something along those lines as being the ultimate challenge in a way, because it requires, precise control of more or less everything. And it also requires a lot of, patience and trial and error, because in the end, the flavor profile in those types of beers is very delicate. You need a balance of malt flavors. The hops really should be present but not dominate. And, mouthfeel and finish are so important, not to mention foam and clarity and so on. But the point is ultimately that in the profile that we're trying to create in these types of beers, there's not much, if anything, to hide behind. Now, what I mean by that is if you have a hint of DMS, you'll see it. You'll know. If the diacetyl is there and too high, you'll know. It's a fine line between, to quote Spinal Tap, it's a fine line between brilliant and stupid, and that just means you got to get it. You got to get it right on so many levels, or it's all wrong. Yeah, great to be here. One of the first things I think we should do when we want to talk about beer flavors is to drink a beer. What does everybody say to that?
I'm on that page. I've got 4 of them here. I am dying to open.
Perfect. Well, let's start with Augustiner. I picked up a variety of things just at our local shop, Appalachian Vintner. So shout out to those guys. They have a tremendous selection. And I wanted to get a few things that are very different from each other so that we can talk about how they're different in terms of flavor and how they're different in terms of technique. So if you have an Augustiner Edelstoff, open it up and we're going to pour it. I've been waiting all evening for this. I'm very thirsty.
I'm on that page. I'm going to see if I can pour it and not spill it.
So I'm joining you from my basement. I'm not at the brewery, and neither is Doug, but that is our brewery behind Doug there. If you haven't been to visit us, I hope you do as soon as visitation is more conducive.
I'll take that full screen while I'm pouring.
So first and foremost, cheers, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Let's try this beer. Wonderful foam, nice and clear, very light blonde color. And they call this a export lager, or sometimes a Dortmunder style export. These are very subtle differences. A lot of people might know Augustiner for their Helles. I think that is what they're best known for. They're in Munich. It's nearly impossible to visit the brewery, so don't even try. If anybody on the line has been in the brewery, I want to know how you did it. But they do have absolutely fantastic guest houses that you can go and drink the Helles fresh. The differences between their Helles, which most people know, and this one are very subtle. And it has to do with original gravity, final gravity, and ABV for the most part. Probably you wouldn't find much differences in the hopping. I don't know the details of the recipe, but when you taste it, there's definitely a sweetness there. You get, this one's pretty fresh too. I don't know the date, but it tastes great. You get a, fresh baked bread. You get a little bit of graham, but not much. I wouldn't say there's any biscuit type character to it. Maybe a hint of honey, because it is a little bit sweeter on the finish than their Helles. But aromatically, the hopping is very subtle. It's quote unquote noble. So that means you have herbal characters which are going to dominate with maybe a little bit of spicy. So herbal character.
Art asked a good question while you're doing that. He says, why do you turn the glass to the side when you're smelling?
That's funny. It's really kind of a habit, but here's what I do. And I do it, I don't know if you can see, so that I can put my nose all the way in there. And I know that's not best practices for sharing beers and for foam stability, but I really do find that I get the full aromatic experience when I do that. So I'm used to doing that, so I apologize, everybody.
No, that I have never heard that before. I think that's a fantastic Art. What a great question.
Yeah, get into it. Dive right into as much as you can. That's what I say. So
Scott,
yeah,
I was particularly impressed, with the clarity, but this one seems more delicate. Now, I have tried the other three. To be a good host, I've got to try several before do the event, and this one is the most delicate. And how do I differentiate the I guess lower flavor, lower aromatics that is this in the Augustiner versus the other lagers that we're going to try today?
Well, think about this beer really as a stronger version of a Helles, very slightly stronger. I want to say this beer is, 5.6% ABV in EU, but interestingly, they say it's 5.7 here in the US. I'm not sure why that would be. And we're probably talking about a finishing gravity around, probably approaching 3 Plato. So you really get that sweetness. But the point is that, and what really differentiates a Helles from a Pilsner is a Helles has more mouthfeel, and it's less bitter, and it has less hop aroma. So you're talking about an incredibly clean finishing lager with 0 defects that's drinkable all day long because it's clean finishing and it doesn't have a bitter aftertaste. A Pilsner, on the other hand, and we'll get to one of those here in a minute, those are drier, so they're more highly attenuated. They might not have much difference in ABV, but the point isn't that. The point is mouthfeel, and then that relationship of the malt characteristics and the hopping. And by hopping, I'm referring to bitterness and aroma and flavor. So Pilsner is going to be more focused on the hops, and the Helles is going to be more focused on the malt, more or less, generally speaking. And the Dortmunder or export, that is going to be even further, and we're talking very subtle here, guys, very subtle, even more focused on the malt. So you get more of a malt sweetness, yet it's still, even though it's a little bit sweet on the finish, I mean, it's clean. It leaves you with a really pleasant aftertaste, no lingering bitterness at all, and it's highly drinkable.
How would you describe the hop aromas?
Well, I would really describe it as focused in, if you want to talk about the hop sort of general characteristics, you have floral, you have herbal, you've got spicy, you've got woody, and several other types of fruit type descriptions. But in the hops that we're talking about here, and I don't know what they're using, but I would imagine they're hops like Tettnanger or Hallertauer Mittelfrüh or Spalter, things like this. These hops are herbal. They can be a little grassy. I think a lot of
it's kind of a green tea.
Yeah.
Kind of aromatic. But I mean, it's compared to all the rest of the lagers we're going to try tonight, the hop characteristics are almost non-existent to me.
That's right. And that's the funny thing in terms of subtlety. I recall I've judged at the European Beer Star Awards many times. And it's funny when you're on panels with Germans in specific, or even, folks who are used to and brew themselves, continental type Pilsners and Helles. They can pick out, 1 or 2 BUs difference from beer to beer. And I think that's an incredible skill. I don't know if I could do that. They can definitely distinguish between a Satz and a Mittelfrüh. Whereas for us, we tend to say, well, it's a little grassy, it's a little herby. Maybe there's a hint of menthol in there, a little basil, things like that. But that just comes from years and years of experience. But you're right, Doug. It's extremely subtle. And generally, I would say that the hops that you would want to choose when you're trying for a very authentic version of the style should be those, quote unquote, noble European varieties. Because, and this is just a little bit of an aside, they are low in myrcene, which is very much a no-no on beers like this. And they're high in farnesene, which is highly desirable. These are different types of hop oils that really give that characteristic that we're talking about. So myrcene being that dominant hop oil fraction in U.S. grown hops, like Cascade or Citra or, hops like that. They're very, very high in myrcene, which gives you that pine, resin to citrusy type character. And that is very distinctive, particularly to the Europeans, and it has no place in Helles, they will tell you. Although I'm all for experimentation, so I'm not saying don't do that.
Well, Scott, before we move on and leave this, what would you, if somebody was going to brew a clone of this, what do you think? I mean, there's a lot of things to me that would be very intimidating to try and brew it, but for you, what would you concentrate on the most? Gary says he's asking questions about the water profile. Would it be the water profile?
Well, this is the perfect time to jump into some of the nuts and bolts. And let's start with water. So everyone knows from studying the kind of origins of the style Pilsner that it has a lot to do with the water quality in Pilsen. And that's just a coincidence in a way that region has that water. A lot of people think of beer style development as evolving slowly but surely over time by many decades or even century of trial and error until the perfect balance of all the beer's characteristics come into harmony, and that all starts with the water. And I don't think it's pure coincidence that Pilsner originated in an area with extremely soft water. because that is so important to the character of the finished beer. So soft water is a must. And by soft, we're talking, the general classic rule of thumb in the German texts is, of course, they use for sort of a hardness measurement, the degree German hardness. And they say you need no more, at the most, 5 degrees German hardness in your water to make Pilsner type beer. And what is a German degree hardness? Well, I had to make a conversion here. So let me look at my notes. It is equivalent to 0.35 milligrams per liter, which is the same as a ppm of calcium carbonate. Okay, so calcium carbonate, everyone can find that in their water profiles. So 0.35, that's 1 degree German hardness. That's not much. We're talking pretty close to RO water, really. But that's not the whole story either. You have to consider one of the things that the German degree hardness takes into account is you have the generally speaking, you've got ions in the water which tend to be pH increasing in your mash, and you have some that tend to be pH decreasing. Okay, and then the relationship between those has to do or is calculated to be a total hardness or residual alkalinity. So what tends to raise your pH in your mash? The biggest enemy for that are your carbonates. So carbonates and bicarbonates. So when you have a high amount of hardness, your mash pH will tend to want to raise. And when you want to decrease your the tendency for the mash pH to raise, you're going to typically do one of a couple of things. Either pre-treat your water so that you can reduce that carbonate hardness using things like lime and RO or membrane filtration, things like that. Or maybe you're lucky and you just have soft water where you live. And I'm going to raise my hand because here in Western North Carolina, we have very soft water. So that's a little bit of a blessing for us.
So Scott, Joseph says, do the Germans boil their water to help with temporary softness?
Yeah, that's one thing you can do. When you do boil water, for those who have ever experienced this, when you have very hard water and you boil it like in a teapot, you're going to find that it quickly builds up a lot of calcium scale on the inside. So that's a pretty easy way to reduce your calcium hardness, but it's less effective on your carbonate hardness. So that's why the lime type treatments are useful for that, or reverse osmosis, of course, takes care of that immediately. But when you want to get your mash pH just right, and when we're talking beers like this, generally, I like to see probably no lower than about 5.2. Lower than that, and you might make your enzymes a little bit unhappy. But certainly no higher than about 5.5. So I tend to favor the lower end of the scale because I find that you have less tendency for tannin extraction in your mash and your lautering, which can give you an astringency. And in a beer like this, a little bit of an astringent character is really going to show up pretty easily. A lower wort pH also produces a finer bitterness quality. So a crisp, clean finishing bitterness. So those are very important aspects in addition to just enzymic conversion windows in the mash. So a lot of folks will add calcium, which tends to help acidify the mash via reactions with phosphates. That's only going to take you so far. So if you happen to have hard water and you can't do that much about it, and even if you don't have hard water, a very common technique that people do is to acidify your mash using lactic acid. And that's a very traditional thing to do. Probably these breweries that you're going to see here today, Augustiner for sure, Schonramer probably, are using lactic acid to acidify their mash. Lactic acid is, let's move to the next beer. This is a Pilsner. I'll talk about it here in a second. Before I lose my train of thought, lactic acid generally is produced at the breweries. They normally would have a lactic acid plant wherein you can produce lactic acid with Lactobacillus delbrueckii, I think is the classic organism for that. You can also do it on a very low tech way, but take some wort, ideally around 12 to 13 Plato, and you can inoculate it with Lactobacillus delbrueckii. And this is important. It must be completely anaerobic because you need to keep it at around 100 degrees, 105 degrees F. And then you'll have very rapid acidification of that wort without fermentation. But if it's aerobic, you will absolutely at those temperatures have bacillus growth, and you will have acetobacter growth, which is the worst thing. So you're going to get a real vinegar type character. So an anaerobic lactic acid production plant is very common throughout Europe at Pilsner breweries to make sure their mash pH is exactly where it needs to be, rather than screw around with the water too much. Because guess what? There's this thing called the Reinheitsgebot, which is the purity law of 1516, which tells you that you can't screw around with the water, and you can't, and I'm paraphrasing, and you can't add stuff to it that's not malt, hops, water, and yeast. And the water is always one of those funny things where people have different impressions on what you can and can't do. But anyway, long story short, brewing water for Pilsner type beers, you want a soft water if you can get it. And if you can't, you want to acidify with lactic, and it doesn't take much. It really doesn't. It's also quite important to have a minimum of around, let's say, 40 to 50 ppms of calcium in your pump-in wort for other reasons. So adding a little bit of calcium, or if you have it in your water already, is great. And if that doesn't get you the pH that you need or want, then use some lactic.
Well, Scott, are we ready to move on to the Schonramer Pils?
Let's do it.
I'm going to pour mine while you're talking.
Great. Yeah, Schonramer is one of my favorites. This beer is brewed in really southern Bavaria, very close to Austria, by an American expat named Eric Toft, who is an excellent brewer, a good friend of mine, and he won World Beer Cup Gold with this beer. When was it? Maybe in 14 or so, something like that. So when we want to compare and contrast this one versus the Augustiner, let's talk about the mouthfeel and the hop presence. Let's just call it presence. And by that, we're talking about bitterness and flavor and aroma. Great foam. I even have it on my nose.
Yeah. And the clarity is phenomenal.
Isn't it? And the beer that I have here isn't the freshest thing in the world. I want to say it'll be a year old this coming November, if I'm reading my dates right. But it's if you can get it fresh, you will find this to be one of the best Pilsners on the planet.
Well, you had mentioned actually when we were sourcing these that if you can get it draft, that the drafts are pretty good also, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the draft tends to hold up better generally than the bottle because you don't have air ingress through the liner of the crown in a keg. So it does hold up a little bit better. So let's talk about this beer. The first thing that hits me is this beer is much, much drier on the mouthfeel than the Augustiner is. I mean, there's malt flavor. You get that classic, real grainy, malty flavor that you need in either of those styles, but there's no sweetness really at all. It's quite dry. I would say it's the attenuation is probably, I don't know, 2 Plato or give or take. It's quite dry. It's also more bitter. And the aroma is more floral than the Augustiner. That's more herbal, I would say. Yep. And then this one is really nicely floral and a little grassy.
Well, you're right. Turning your nose is just fantastic. I always learn something when I hang around you, Scott.
Mm. Yeah, I wish it was more. It was easier to do that nowadays in the tap room, but someday soon.
Well,
yeah, boy, that's dry.
That's the best thing.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a number of Pilsners that I guess I really like that are pretty commercially available. I can talk a little bit about Bitburger, Premium Pils, almost like the gold standard stateside anyway for the style because it's easy to come by. It's generally fresh, and it's really dang good. I like Jever. That's Jever. That's from the very north of Germany. That is among the commercially available Pilsners, probably the hoppiest. And as a hophead, I really appreciate that. But
well, that didn't work too well. The lacing on that glass.
Yeah.
That is awesome.
Yeah. Well, for those of you who judge beer, in beers of this type, foam and lacing and foam stability is one of the higher point earning, certainly the highest point earning on the visual end of it. But it's very important, very critical. I've seen people in restaurants in Germany send beer back if it didn't have foam, at least an inch of foam on it. No, they'd send it back. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about malt flavor. And this is one of the things that when we get into the next couple of beers, and we've got Summerfest here, and we've got Southern Gothic. When we get into these, you're going to find that the flavors are really quite different. It's for what we're going for in our beers, we're really looking for more of a hop focus and less of a malt focus, but maintaining the same type of drinkability. I'm really convinced that to get that characteristic, European classic Pilsner flavor in terms of malt, and some of you are gonna, fall out of your chairs maybe and send me hate mail, but I really firmly believe that even though it's out of favor for a long time now, decoction mashing is so widely done still that it's critical to the flavor profile of beers like this. Decoction mashing is something that most breweries here in the U.S. cannot do physically. It takes specialized equipment. As you look at behind Doug there, in our brew house, we don't have a mash cooker. We simply have a mash tun. And like as all of you know, you can mash in, you can raise the temperature, you can raise it again, you can raise it all day long, but that's all you can do. You can't do a decoction mash. And what that means is you're going to take a portion of your mash and you're going to move it to the mash cooker or the decoction vessel, and you're going to bring it up to a boil nearly around 208 degrees. I think that's about 95 C, which I think is the standard. And then you bring it back to the main mash. So years and years ago, a lot of you will know this, that was a necessary practice back in the days before the real science of malting was widely understood and controllable. And so the modification of the malts and the enzymes present were certainly very different than they are today. The flavor profile by doing a decoction really is certainly different than doing an infusion or even a step mash, which is what we would do in the case of some of our lagers that we make here. And we'll talk about that too.
So Scott, Sierra Nevada does not have a way to do decoction?
No, we don't. Well, on the rare occasion, we do kind of a quasi decoction. This is the best that we can do in our brewery, where we'll mash in the minimum amount of mash that we can with our system into the mash tun and still cover the heating jacket. So fortunately, in our case, we have a bottom heating zone and we have a side heating zone. Mm-hmm. And so we'll mash in just enough to cover the bottom, and we'll take that through some steps and finally boil it. Then we'll mash in the rest of the mash on top of it, quite cold, so that the blend of this 20% or something that you boiled and the 80% or so that you mashed in cool comes in at your target first rest temperature. So we can do that, and we do on occasion, but generally not.
So I'm going to put you on the spot.
Sure.
You won a World Beer Cup with the Pilsner, right?
Yeah. That was in
Sierra Nevada.
2010.
9 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
But you did it without decoction.
That's true. I did not do a decoction on that one. And I'll come back to that. I actually have right here, I printed out just for the thing here. This is the original copy of the World Beer Cup winner Pilsner recipe. I want to show you the whole thing, but we'll talk about it quite a lot. It was a long time ago. I can't remember everything that I did, so I wanted to make sure.
We did it without decoction.
We did it without decoction. But decoction is done by some of the most well-known Pilsner brewers in the world, including Bitburger, Schonramer, Weihenstephaner. You've got, of course, they're known for their wheat beer, but they still do wonderful lagers. Even Pilsner Urquell.
Well, that ought to encourage the guys. Yesterday, I was at Burning Blush Brewery. They were kind enough, by the way, to supply this glassware, which I thought was very nice. Mm-hmm. And so we were thinking about decoction and the importance of it, or wrestling with the importance of it. So I think you just settled. Well, I don't know. You muddied the water because you said you really need it to brew it right, but you've won a cup without it.
Well, there are tricks.
I don't know that
there are tricks. But to really get the malt flavor right, a decoction is done. And for example, some of the biggest breweries in Germany will do a double decoction. So I'll describe it very briefly. So I made some notes here so I can convert from C to F. So a very common technique is you mash in your entire mash at 136 degrees. So this is very high up on the proteinase range. So there'll be a very minimal proteinase activity, which is okay. You really don't want much, because if you have a lot of proteinase activity, you will miss this beautiful, glorious foam lacing. So you want to miss that if you can. So very short rest at the very high 130s. Then decoction number one occurs. And this is a volume that you have to calculate based on your own system, but you're just talking about a blending calculation. So you want to take out a portion of your mash, ramp it pretty steadily up to 95C. I believe that's about 128 or so. So let's call it pretty much boiling. You're going to hold it there for as much as 30 minutes. So 15 to 30 minutes, I would say. Then you're going to take that and put it back in your main mash. And depending on how much you take, you have to calculate that. But if you're, let's say, around a quarter of your total mash, then when you put that back in, you should be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 154 or so, which puts you right smack in the middle between the optimum beta and the optimum alpha amylase temperatures. So then you start getting your starch conversion to happen at that point in time. But you've already added a healthy dose of malt and grain flavors into your beer that you wouldn't have been able to achieve otherwise by doing that decoction. So does that make sense? So you have to calculate how much mash would it take at boiling temperature when you mix it back in to raise to your next rest temperature. And that's generally between 25 and 30% of your full mash. So that's the technique. So you're not heating your mash up in the mash tun. The mash tun is just sitting there stirring. Okay. And then what's heating it to the next step is the amount of decocted mash that you have boiled, and then you put it back and blend them together. And the temperature doesn't gradually ramp up to your next rest. It goes bam right there because you put in 25% boiling mash right into it. So you can really pinpoint those amylase rest temperatures exactly. So then it's pretty typical to do a second decoction to bring you to your mashing out temperature, which is classically about 172 degrees, but people go anywhere from 165 to 172, never above 172, by the way. But then you're going to take another portion of your mash.
Well, that begs the question. Why not above 172?
Well, because a prolonged rest at that time, and by prolonged rest, at that temperature, you're going to really, particularly at higher pHs, you're going to end up with an astringent beer for sure, because you'll get a lot of tannins out of the husk of the malt.
Okay.
And so now people are wondering, yeah, but you're boiling some mash, so aren't you doing that anyway? Yeah, but only for 15 minutes or so. Whereas if you bring your mash out temperature above 172, it goes to the lautering at that temperature as well, and it stays there more or less for the hour and a half or whatever it takes you to lauter. So that's too long at that temperature.
Okay, so it's prolonged at 172 that you begin to get that astringency from the husks.
Yeah, that's right. That is accentuated dramatically, logarithmically, the higher the pH is.
Yeah.
So that's why I really like to target those lower, as low as I can get away with in the mash tun and still have happy enzymes. That's what I target. I target that 5.2.
So Andy says decoction accentuates roundness or fullness, and it transcends step mashing. What do you think about Andy's comment?
I agree, Andy. That's exactly what I'm talking about. When you're building a beer, which is, focused on nuance, those types of things really do stand out. You wouldn't notice such a thing in an IPA, probably, but in a beer like a Helles, absolutely. It's the difference between a good Helles and a great Helles.
So Gary asked, do you monitor pH during the decoction? Is that certainly seemed to be right where you were?
I typically don't. Gary, I measure it once I, reach my, once I'm mashed in and fully homogenized. That'll be Oh, and I measure it at temperature, by the way. I want to say somebody asked me that comment quite a ways up there about measuring pH at temperature. There's a lot of literature out there about that, but I do measure it at temperature. And I measure it right when you're completely mashed in and homogeneous. And then I don't check it again until I'm collecting wort. So I'll check my first runnings, and I'll certainly monitor. I'll miss my first runnings quite a lot, sometimes, to be honest with you, because generally they're pretty much the same as what the mash was. But the last runnings is really key because, as you know, those carbonates in your water are going to work slowly but surely, not only in your mash, but as you're sparging, particularly as you're sparging, and your wort collection pH will go up and up and up. And you've got to watch that very carefully. A lot of folks will even acidify their sparge water to make damn sure that does not occur. Just throwing it out there.
Well, but before we move on to the Summerfest, Scott asks, and you would know this having studied in Germany, and he says, do the Germans mash off at 170 F?
It's as variable as it is here. I know a lot of brewers who will mash off at, let me get my converter going here. Sorry, guys. We'll mash off at 165. And that's low, but you still have alpha amylase activity at that temperature. And part of the reason for doing that technique is that, remember, in your lauter ton, as long as you haven't raised the temperature so high to denature the enzymes, they will still be active. And if you are, maybe your milling capability still leaves you with some hard kernel ends or something like this, you risk starch haze in your Pilsner if you can't fully break the starch down. So it depends on the system. If you find that in the lautering, you with the raking, going around and being pretty aggressive like that, that you still get some iodine positive worts off your lauter, and you can check that as you go, then you might want to lower your mash off temperature a little bit. But if you find that that's never a problem, you can mill quite finely and still run off okay, then go ahead and raise it all the way up to 172. Because the higher the temperature, the lower the viscosity, and the easier time you're going to have in your lauter, and the more efficient wort extraction you're going to realize. So long story short, go as high as you can, up to 172, that you can get away with your system that you have.
Well, Scott, we've got 2 more beers and we have 18 questions. So are we ready to jump into Summerfest?
Let's do Summerfest. This one, following the last 2, should be something of a flavor shock. Let's give it a pour here.
And while you're pouring it, Andy says, thanks. That was his question on the 170.
Absolutely, Andy. Just throw those questions out there as we go. Remember, this is me trying to be useful for all of you. So if there's something that we haven't talked about that you want to talk about, let's do it. So this beer, by appearances, is pretty similar. This is the Augustiner here on the would that be my right, your left? This is the Schonramer. They look all about the same, don't they? Bright, brilliant, in fact. Good foam, good lacing. But wow, that's a completely different beer when you smell it. Completely different beer. I get a lot of lemon, even a little bit of pine.
So Scott, there are your 3 beers.
Yeah, don't they look the same?
Yeah.
But they are vastly, vastly different from each other. The Summerfest would never stand a chance, never, in the German Pilsner category, never. The hops are all wrong. the hop intensity is too high, and it's got almost a conundrum of a finish where you've got a sweetness reminiscent of the level of sweetness that you would expect in a Helles versus a Pilsner, but the bitterness of a Pilsner. So it's its own different animal. We tend to call it I don't know, what do we call it? We call it Summerfest. I don't know. It defies category. But a lot of lemon, some pine. I even get a little bit of tortilla, corn chip, not DMS corn. That's different, but like a grainy character that reminds you of a tortilla. DMS is a whole different thing entirely. None of these are very sulfury, by the way, but it's not unusual to get a little bit of sulfur in a fresh Pilsner, and this would be the eggy type character, which is hydrogen sulfide, H2S. That diminishes as the beer ages and almost goes away completely. But SO2, sulfur dioxide, is that matchstick kind of sulfur aroma, and that's a little bit more pervasive in a Pilsner. And that's, believe it or not, we try and get a SO2 in our lagers because SO2 is a very effective help. It's very helpful in beer flavor stability. So it's a very powerful antioxidant. So SO2 can be present in beer up to 10 ppm. Anything higher than that requires it to be noted on the label. That's why on a lot of wines, they will say contains sulfides because they're higher than 10 ppms. So SO2, H2S are certainly not uncommon.
So Gary asked, does the SO2 also help with crispness?
Mm-hmm. I think it does. I really do. I really do think it does. Somebody was asking, Doug, and let's maybe try and field a couple of questions here. There was quick lagering methods.
Yep.
There are some other questions about how to know when lagering is lagering enough. How do you know when enough?
Well, let's take. Can we do this one? Because Mike Konarski asked about sulfur. Can we do that question since we're right there?
Let me see. Where is it?
I'll read you. So Mike asks, sulfur, appropriate in small quantities.
Ah.
How would you drive off sulfur from a lager? Warmer, more vigorous ferment, bubbling CO2 through the beer when finished, or just aging?
Yeah, great question. So there are loads of different sulfur compounds that you can commonly find in beers. Let's talk only about that eggy sulfur that we've all smelled in our cellars when lagers are fermenting. So then you've got the SO2, which is that matchstick aroma. So the H2S is that eggy, like a boiled egg, hard-boiled egg aroma, and that is produced during fermentation by the yeast. And it's somewhat of a strain-dependent function. Some strains do more so than others, but it's also influenced by fermentation temperature. So let's say, general rule of thumb, colder is going to give you more H2S. But don't worry, because H2S does flash off because it's volatile. And a lot of ways to get rid of that is just wait a while because it will diminish over time. Or you can, what do we call it at the brewery? Sometimes we call it burping the tank. Not a very flattering term, but when you do a rapid pressure release of the tank, you create a lot of CO2 evolution, which is going to scrub a lot of that up and out. And you can really smell it in the cellar. So you give it a burp, don't blow it down all the way, but relieve the pressure, then wait 10 minutes, then come back and do it again. And you'll find that there's a heck of a lot of sulfur in the headspace there, and that'll blow right out. You can also purge it out in a way, or scrub it with like an air stone with CO2, of course. You don't want to oxidize your beer, and that'll also be effective. Or like I said, you could just wait, because typically towards the end of lagering, you won't notice it anymore. And your perception of sulfur will be more, hopefully, towards the SO2 end and less of the H2S end. SO2, conversely, you cannot scrub it out. You can't burp it out. You can't get rid of it. Once it's in there, it's in there. And the only way it goes down is very slowly over time, because it's reacting in the beer slowly over time. It's an antioxidant, and it is not volatile. So if it's very high in that matchstick, it's going to be like that for a long time. One of the things you can do to control that level in your beer, believe it or not, has to do, again, with strain dependency, but also with aeration. When you stress your yeast by starving it of air, you will produce more SO2. However, it's a double-edged sword, right? What else happens when we starve our yeast of air during pitching? Well, you risk a lagging or even stalled fermentation, which is probably worse. So you just have to experiment a little bit with that.
Well, Scott, we are almost at the bottom of the hour, and we promised everybody we get through the main part of our program and then the questions. So do we want to go ahead and jump into this Southern Gothic?
Yeah, let's pour that one. I probably won't say too much about it, other than it is different again from Summerfest. Summerfest uses a lot of whirlpool hopping, and a single infusion mash. Southern Gothic uses a step mash, and it's unfiltered, so it's a Zwickel Pils, but it's very floral with a lot of lemon. We use what do we put in this? We use Saphir and Sterling. So Saphir is a German aroma hop that's very lemony, and Sterling is a domestic aroma hop, which is a little bit piney and kind of grassy. So very different. Again, it's a little bit more round in terms of malt and mouthfeel, a little bit lower in bitterness, just a little more round in general overall. But the hop aroma is very different from Summerfest, as you guys can tell. Yeah, it's really nice. And this one is probably about 5 months old, I would say, but it's holding up pretty well. I don't know if you guys would agree. Tastes okay to me.
Mine is very nice. This is my favorite of the four.
Yeah.
Chris is complimenting the glass. Actually, my friend Steve Morgan helped me with the glass. So cheers, Steve. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Let's see here. Let's get back into the questions here. We talked a little bit about a lot of things. Let's go quickly from the top. Quick lagering methods.
That one has the highest number of votes from Graco. So
Right.
Have you tried any of the quick lagering methods? And if so, what's your opinion on them?
Yeah, there's tons of approaches to that. Obviously, the first thing you need to do is complete primary fermentation. Then after that, you have to reduce diacetyl. And there's various opinions on reducing diacetyl. Some people will leave the beer at primary fermentation temperature and just give it time. And that might take, if you're fermenting at 48 and you leave it at 48 during the diacetyl reduction period, it might take you 7 or 8 days or 10 days. But you don't risk any yeast stress. And you probably might believe there's a little bit finer quality in the finished beer. But like in Summerfest, what we do is at the end of primary fermentation, when the extract has all been reduced, then we will change the tank set point temperature so that you let it raise up, approaching 60 degrees F, but really probably not reaching it. And of course, the warmer you get, the faster diacetyl will reduce. And with that technique, you can probably complete primary fermentation and diacetyl reduction all together in, say, 7 or 8 days. So that might save you a lot of time. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention is there's a lot of different opinions too about when you're chilling your beer down after diacetyl reduction. There's a school of thought that says you should do so slowly and gently, so that you don't have a very rapid flocculation of your yeast. That way the yeast can continue to reduce diacetyl and also reduce kind of the classical, green beer character that is often noted in young lagers from the compound acetaldehyde. And acetaldehyde is created by the yeast and will also be reduced by the yeast very slowly. But it's a completely different mechanism than diacetyl. But a high amount of acetaldehyde gives you, some people perceive it like green apple, almost Jolly Rancher type apple. And oddly, other people, and I'm one of those, perceive it more like a pumpkin. So when you cut a pumpkin and you're carving it, that pumpkin flesh kind of aroma is how I perceive acetaldehyde. Some people even get it.
It reminds me more of a latex, kind of a solventy latex.
Sure.
But so bottom line, you're not enthusiastic about any of the quick lagering methods.
Well, I wouldn't say that. It really depends on your yeast. I know that Augustiner, for example, is notorious for taking a long time to reach lagering temperatures, chilling at a rate of, a degree per day, and then lagering for 6 weeks. So, very traditional approaches. But my opinion on that is that's what works for their beer and their yeast. Bitburger, on the other hand, beautiful beer. Also, as soon as diacetyl reduction is completed, they will crash cool the beer through a glycol heat exchanger. So lightning quick, crash it immediately from 50 degrees all the way to 28 degrees, just like that. And then they'll lager it like we do for 3 weeks, and that's plenty. But, it depends on what you're going for, honestly. But for my money, I would pay close attention to your acetaldehyde levels. Firstly, how much are you creating with your fermentation practices and your pitching rate, for example? How much are you creating in the first place? That determines how much you also have to reduce before you will call lagering completed. So you can maybe split the difference and work to create less grain beer character so that your lagering time doesn't have to be quite as elongated. Does that make any sense?
I think it does. That was a good answer and a great question, Grayco. Scott, since we're at the bottom of the hour, what I'd like to do, since this is probably the largest number of lagers I've ever had open except at a beer judging, maybe you could comment on any of the differences between these that you see. One of the things I noticed is your Southern Gothic has a little haze compared to the others. Are there any other aspects that you could touch on?
Yeah, the haze is there because it's unfiltered. So we call it, it says right on the package, unfiltered Pils. It's sometimes referred to as a Zwickel Pils or a Zwickel beer. Zwickel, Zwickle. that is the German term for a sample valve located on a fermenter. So when you're drinking Zwickel beer, you're drinking it right off the tank, unfiltered. So that's sort of what we're going for here. Really, the hallmarks of it are we still have that, kind of a assertive Sierra Nevada hop presence that is our MO. And it's sort of a hybrid between a European profile with some resinous U.S. domestic notes in there as well. But you do have that malt brownness to it, whereas the Summerfest is a little crisper and less malt forward and a little less round. The Schonramer, to me, is by far the driest of the bunch. It's really quite drying. There's a bitterness to it that helps balance that dryness. And the hop aroma is very floral to me. And the Augustiner is maybe, among the highest on the drinkability scale of the night, let's say. It has that's the Summerfest, I can tell. Let's see. There it is. It has a real fresh herb character to it. You got that beautiful malt forward aroma and flavor, not overwhelmed by hops, zero defects, a little bit of a sweet finish, and highly crushable all day long.
So Scott, I guess the last question on this before we move into the questions, I noticed the only one that has any lacing, and maybe it's because I didn't clean the glassware well, it is the Schonramer. So any comments on that?
Yeah, I would say that's probably the same for me. I've got a little bit of lacing here left in that one. Yeah. And, it could be differences in the malt that they're using. Pilsner malt is very different than pale ale malt. We're using mainly pale ale malt in our lagers and a little bit of Pilsner malt and a little bit of Munich normally, once in a while some Carapils, never any crystal. Whereas in Schonramer's case, I would assume they're using entirely Pilsner malt, which is a much lower degree of modification than pale ale malt. And who knows what they're doing in terms of their mashing profile. But there are a lot of ways you can impact foam stability.
All right. Well, I think we are a little bit past the bottom of the hour, and I always like to promise everybody that we'll have a transition and go into the Q&A at that point. So for those that have to run and they want to catch the play, or they only wanted to catch the more organized part of the program, I appreciate you so much for coming and enjoying our program today. Scott, I appreciate you coming. Scott, do you have time to dive in these other 18 questions?
I certainly do. It's the end of my day. I'm always happy to sit here surrounded by a few beers and talk about beers. So I'll give it a little bit more time. No problem.
Excellent. Okay, so we've got 18 questions. Now, we can still probably take a few more, but maybe more importantly, rather than asking another question, everybody gets one vote. So if you vote, that'll push maybe the most important questions to get answered first, and those at the end that, if by chance we don't get to, maybe have less priority to audience. And Scott, before we move on, I just want to confirm again, in our poll, our audience is primarily interested in, when you're looking at aspects of lager brewing, the biggest question that our audience today says in the poll is choosing the best fermentation, temperature, timing, and pitch rate. So that's the biggest nagging question. Water profile's right behind that.
Okay.
So we will move into the first question. Dan has that one voted up the highest. And he says, I asked a brewery in Germany, Distillhauser, maybe. Am I pronouncing that close?
Yep.
About their diacetyl rest, procedure, times, temperature, etc. They said they don't bother with it. I was left to assume that they ferment on this warm side of the yeast temperature range. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I hinted at that one earlier, where if you do, well, let me back up a half a step. So pitching temperature is in the range of anywhere from, 42 to 52 F. I would say a lot of brewers that I talk to really like the 46, 47 degree pitching temperature. That, of course, is dependent entirely on your yeast condition and storage situation. Above anything else with yeast, leading into and coming out of fermentation, you really don't want temperature shocks. So you can get away with a 46 degree pump in if your yeast is stored at or a little bit lower than that. So we tend to, for the lagers, store the yeast at about 38, and then we pump the wort in even at 48, but I prefer 46 for pump in temperature. Aeration, we won't talk about that. That's a different line of thought. But your primary fermentation temperature generally is a few degrees warmer than your pitching temperature. So, for example, if you're pumping in at 46, you're going to ferment at 48. And then when you come to diacetyl rest time, that's post-fermentation, remember that the yeast are going to keep producing diacetyl until fermentation is completed. And so a lot of different techniques there. When you get to the very tail end of your primary fermentation, you might choose to raise your temperature set point a little bit so that you get a more rapid fermentation completion. How sometimes they can sort of, put along, as we like to say, technical term, put along. They'll put along for a while until they finally get there. But by doing a little bit of a free rise at the end, and I'm not talking free rise, say, for example, going from 46 to 49 or 50, still quite cold, then you might get a quicker end of that tail end of primary. And you'd be surprised at how impactful just a few degrees increase in temperature has on the rate that your yeast will reduce diacetyl again. So that said,
so a little warmer fermentation eliminates the diacetyl rest.
Well, I wouldn't say so. There's no eliminating it. In ale brewing, when you're fermenting at 68 or whatever, the diacetyl is being reduced pretty much as quickly as it's being produced. So there's really no need there. The only time you're going to have diacetyl on your ales is if you have an incomplete fermentation and you've chilled the beer and the yeast has been removed or flocculated, then it can't reduce that diacetyl anymore. And if you have a diacetyl problem in an ale, then you've got a fermentation practices issue. But in lagers, it's a colder temperature, so the rate of reduction is much slower. So what we do on Summerfest is at the end of primary fermentation, which is, say, 50 to 52, we will change the set point to 60 while it still has a couple of degrees Plato left to go so that the yeast can produce a little bit of exothermic energy and heat that beer up. Otherwise, it's not really going to change in temperature very much. And it'll probably get to 58 or so, and diacetyl is reduced in 3 days about. But I know in Germany, Distelhauser might be one of these where you've got a no temperature change set points occur from primary fermentation until cooling at all. It's just a question of time. And so by don't bother with it, that reminds me of our friends in Bitburg. They will do a pump in at about a 48 and a fermentation at about a 50, I believe, and leave it at 50 the whole time. They don't change the set point. And so when fermentation is over, let's say that's about 8 days, then they don't chill the tank because you don't want to drop the yeast out. And they don't want to elevate the temperature either because there can be off flavors depending on the strain of yeast that you're using by doing that. So I don't know if I'd want to do that either with that type of yeast. But instead, just wait, be patient, and the destil will be reduced, but it might take another 6 or 7 or 8 days. So now you're talking a primary and destil reduction timeline of 2 weeks before you can chill the beer at all. And that's not unusual in Germany. So I'm assuming that when they say they don't bother with it, it's because they have their procedures for various reasons that they don't do a temperature raise for destil reduction. Sorry, that was sort of long-winded. Did I answer the question?
Well, I think it did. Thank you, Dan. Before we move on and get into the question, just a quick opinion. Now, I'm going to put up, do you have a favorite of these for the summertime? We won't pick. Is there a favorite summertime lager for you of these four?
For me, Doug?
Yeah, for you.
Well, I would say that every summer I drink a hell of a lot more Summerfest than any other lager, but that's just access, okay? But that'll do the trick for me, and that's what the flavor of summer is all about.
You don't have to go to the store to get that one.
No, I don't.
Okay. I guess that was a loaded question. All right. So Mike has another good question. He has the highest number of votes. As a modern brewer, when I see traditional lager brewers starting to lower the fermentation temperatures with a Plato or two left, I want to scream, no. Let it warm up a bit. VDK reduction, etc. So the question is there any benefit that you see for dropping the temperature at the end of fermentation?
In a word, no. No, not at all. I think that's somewhat of a nonsense practice. I don't really know of any research work that would support that as being beneficial to flavor. The only thing I could see that doing is elongating your time frame out a bit. So I would not recommend that. No.
All right, good question though, Mike. He's a great brewer. I know Mike. Well, you do too, I think. So Thomas has a good question. So at what stage do you hop your lagers? And are you rousing the hops in the tank with CO2? Now, if so, do you rouse or mix the hops in the tank by bursts or continuous CO2 injection through the racking arm? It still keeps going, so keep going. Are you ever dry hopping similar to Tipo Pils from Barifico Italiano? I probably brutalized that. Who claim they dry hop very deep late into conditioning at a very cold temperature, 1 degree C, shortly before packaging. So that's a lot of questions there. So at what stage do you dry hop your lagers?
Yeah, I'll just sort of dive right into that one, Doug. Great question, Thomas. I appreciate that one. We don't typically dry hop the lagers. Summerfest is not dry hopped. Southern Gothic is not dry hopped. Oktoberfest typically is not dry hopped either. I think we've done that once. But we have made several, seasonal offerings that are dry hop lagers, and we've done that in a number of different ways. For example, we have maybe some of you know we have a dry hopping process with whole cone hops called the Torpedo. Anybody familiar with that one? That's something that we came up with back in 06 or 05 maybe. And that's because we had a need to dry hop with whole cone hops. And so a lot of people are familiar with this type of technology nowadays, but we still do it.
Sullivan shared some details on that, even had a picture to share with us when in his live stream that he did on the barrel aging.
Yeah. Just a couple of comments here. It's my pleasure to be here, guys. Anytime I can be of use, and hell, just talking about beer is great. I love it. So thanks for being here, everybody. But yeah, the torpedo is a way. A lot of people are familiar with, kind of the Randall type approach, where essentially you're going to run beer through a filter bed of whole cone hops in order to infuse that beer with said hops. And that's essentially what the torpedo is doing. But we also use enriched lupulin powder. So this is something we've been doing for quite a while too. But it's, let's see, it's marketed now as cryo hops from Yakima Chief. But essentially, y'all are familiar with different types of hop pellets. You have the classical T90s, you got the T45s, and the lupulin powder is produced using a T35. So that means the whole hops are milled in liquid nitrogen cold conditions. So you're talking, I don't know, minus 300 degrees or something, so that you can mill very finely and not destroy the lupulin glands, and still sift and sieve the material without it being so sticky, because we all know how sticky and resinous hops are. But at minus 300 degrees, they're not so much, as it turns out. So this T35 powder is, hammer milled, nitrogen cooled hops, which are then sieved so that's what the 35 means, is that of the original weight of hops that went into the process, only 35% of it comes out again. The rest of it is removed as that green leafy matter that is not, containing a lot of lupulin. So
Scott, I think the part of Thomas's question was, at what temperature maybe do you put it through the torpedo?
Yeah, and I'm getting there. So we got all these techniques, and what technique you use, and very importantly, when you do that, has a tremendous impact on the character that your beer is going to have. There's a great question here from Joseph about enzyme increasing. I really want to talk about that a little bit. Hop creep is what people refer to that as right now. But generally speaking, when you're, I find very, very big differences in dry hopping in whatever way between ales and lagers. And that has a lot to do with what the lager yeast is doing when it's interacting with those hop compounds. I find that very late dry hopping on lagers, so even post filtration, which we've done, will give you very intense green, grassy, fresh cut hay type aromas initially that will mellow a little bit, but not much as the beer ages. Whereas if you're doing it further upstream, you're going to get a little bit less of that, grass, and more of the herbs and maybe even the fruits, depending on what varieties of hops you're using. So that really makes a big difference. But I will say that you can absolutely, to get to the question literally here, you can absolutely do that post-filtration if that's the character you're going for. But you may think that for whatever reason, balance, flavor, aroma, you may want to do that earlier. And if you do dose that with a torpedo type process, you're recirculating the beer through this device anyway, so there's no reason to rouse the tank. But if you're putting in pellets or powders or even hop oils or any other hop product, you probably do want to stir the tank in whatever way that you can. Every brewery has its limitations. Some people on a tank, you got one opening. It's the inlet, it's the outlet, it's all you got. So in that case, you may want to bubble gas up through there periodically to try and rouse that up. But if you do have multiple openings, you can recirculate with gas or with a pump, which is probably more effective.
Well, I think, Thomas, that was an awesome question. We're going to have to kind of click through these. We got 16 more, then they're all really good. So our next one comes from Tom. What percentage of mash do you usually pull off for decoction?
Yeah, good question. I would say that kind of depends entirely on what your overall mash profile is, what you're trying to achieve. So the bigger the gap in between your rests of your main mash, then the more decocted mash you have to pull off and boil and put back in again. So just off the cuff, if you're going from, say, 140 to about mid 150s, you're going to need about 25%, but you have to calculate that. And it depends really on all those factors. So you can search a blending calculation equation. It's very simple. If I had a whiteboard, I'd do it right here for you. But it's just a function of what temperature do you have, what temperature do you want to go to, and therefore you can calculate how much mash you need to add at boiling temperature to get it there. So it's very straightforward calculation and very accurate.
All right. Thank you, Tom. That was a good question. Thomas has another question. He's been asking hard ones lately. But this goes back to one of the main questions that I think our audience is interested in, Scott. So we'll a little time here. At what temperature do you ferment your lagers? At what stage in the fermentation do you let the temperature of the fermentation rise? For example, day 2 or day 3, or based on a percentage of attenuation, like 60%. Do you let your lagers totally free rise at some point into fermentation, or do you limit or cap the temperature at like 2 to 3 degrees C above the fermentation temperature?
Yeah, great question, Thomas. Real quickly off the cuff, I again want to stress, and this is very, very important, that it depends quite a lot on the strain of yeast that you're using and the character that you're shooting for in your beer. So what I can tell you is that in our lagers, generally, not always, but generally, we're using the Weihenstephan strain 3711. No, it's the standard Weihenstephan strain. And for us, what really works well is pumping in at 48, fermenting at 50 to 52. And then I am a fan, just because in a production environment, time is of the essence, as you all know. And, you run out of real estate in terms of tank space pretty dang quick. So we're trying to, find the best of both worlds with time and results. So, for example, I like to say that we will encourage a diacetyl rest with an elevated temperature. And as I mentioned earlier, I'll typically change the set point to 60 degrees F, which is 15.5, and I'll change the set point when I still have maybe 15% attenuation remaining, so that the yeast has enough metabolic energy to actually warm the tank up. Otherwise, it really won't budge. And typically, we'll end up during that rest period at, we rarely will get to that 15.5 degrees. Normally, we'll only get to about 14 or so, which is about 57.5. But that's enough to allow this particular yeast to reduce the diacetyl completely in 3 additional days. So our total fermentation temperature before chilling is really about 8 or 9 days in full. And for us in a production environment, that's manageable.
All right, Scott, we are at the top of the hour and we have 3 more questions. So if we're going to get through those, I think they're going to be about 2 minutes apiece. So this will be kind of rapid fire.
3470, you nailed it. That was what I was searching for. That's our yeast, 3470. And I don't know, tons of breweries all across the world use that same yeast.
Nathan's on it. Thank you, Nathan. So Thomas has another question. What is the earliest day you start cold crashing your lagers? Day 7, earlier, later? Do you believe that crashing at 1 to 2 crashing at 1 to 2 Celsius per day in a slow way is very important? What temperature do you condition your lagers? And what is the minimum time you cold condition your lagers? That's a rather long question. But I think it's all that temperature profile.
Yeah. So never, ever, ever, you guys, crash your tank before the diacetyl is reduced. Just don't do it, because it won't go anywhere after that, and you'll have it in your beer forever. So don't do it. That can be variable depending on what you do with your fermentation profile. It might be as soon as 8 or 9 days. It might be 14 days. It depends on whether you like to take that elevated diacetyl rest temperature or whether you don't. So that depends. Don't do it until your diacetyl is reduced, and you can either measure that or you can just smell for it or taste it, and you'll get a feel for that over time. Next part is that slow way. That is really interesting question. That one, I hear things on both sides of that fence. Some people say that you should do a very slow chill because that way the yeast won't flocculate quite so rapidly, and you'll have a higher cell count in suspension, which will help mature the beer from that green beer character to matured beer character. For some strains, I would say that's quite important. For others, not. Like I mentioned, if you have a highly flocculent strain, then why would you bother? The yeast is out of it anyway, unless you're doing a Krausen type process, which we didn't talk about at all either, but that's also a very important traditional practice that's very beneficial. Most of you will probably know what Krausening is. So that said, I think crashing at a good clip is fine. And for most of us, you're doing that in your tank, whatever that looks like, and it's just going to take a while because the energy exchange and the jacketing of a tank or in the room that the tank is in takes a while. So you're looking at a chill time of 3 days or something anyway, at best case, and that's probably good enough.
So Scott, as we work through these quicker, the last part of his question, and again, I want to dwell on this a little bit because our poll indicated this is one of the biggest questions that Thomas has asked right here. How long do you cold condition, or what's the minimum time that you cold condition your lagers?
Yep. I really hate to keep saying it depends, but you know what? It depends. There's on the one hand the Augustiner, here it is here. They famously lager for ages and ages, and that's very traditional. The beer is certainly changing over time, whether the yeast has been completely settled and removed or not. In fact, a lot of breweries, what they'll do is they will, for example, after diacetyl reduction, they'll centrifuge the beer and get all the yeast out of it and let it lager with no yeast in it at all. And some breweries will remove the yeast completely, then Krausen it, and then let it lager for a while. There's every iteration you can imagine is done somewhere. But the end of the game for me is you should lager it until the flavors that you want in the beer have materialized. And a lot of times, look at it almost like the famous metaphor of Michelangelo carving a statue. The statue's in there already. You just can't see it because you have to remove all the excess material. And
does clarity have anything to do with it? Joseph is pointing that out.
Maybe not. Maybe not. At very cold temperatures, your lager probably will at some point exhibit chill haze, and that probably won't settle out. And it has nothing to do with yeast, and it doesn't impact maturation rate at all.
So it comes back to the sensory side of things.
It really does. So when your flavor profile is right, then you're done. And if the flavor profile isn't getting there, then you need to think about ways to handle your fermentation and your yeast in particular so that it will get there. And maybe krausening is the answer for you. Somebody mentioned Nathan. Krausening quickly is when you're adding a small amount of beer, which is in what we call high krausen, so the most vigorous active stage of fermentation. So this is fermentation, not respiration. So you're probably talking beer that's 3 days old or something like that. So yeast in its prime, the healthiest, most vigorous yeast that you have. Then you add that to your beer who is green and needs maturation. But the yeast in that older beer is tired. It's maybe gone. It's not present. It's not going to help you anymore. That's not unusual. That's certainly something that happens a lot in lager brewing. By adding your krausen, and that's typically done in the range of 20% by volume, so you need to leave room in your tank for this to occur, then this fresh infusion of very active, very happy, very healthy yeast with no sugar present to chew on anymore are going to now mature your beer quicker than that beer would have matured otherwise. So that's a wonderful way to even reduce the acetal more efficiently and to develop those maturation flavors by removing those green beer character compounds more quickly and more efficiently.
So Thomas, thank you for asking the question that really stood out in the poll as one of the most important. So Scott, we really are going to have to kind of lightning round the rest of these to have a good chance to get through them. Thomas has another question. Do you force carbonate your lagers or do you spud them and try to get carbonation naturally?
We do it naturally by bunging the tank or closing the tank at the tail end of primary fermentation so it builds pressure. And then we maintain the pressure throughout the rest of the process so that the carbonation is maintained. We don't force carbonate.
Is there any bottle conditioning?
Not on lagers. On a lot of our ales we do, but not on lagers.
Yeah. Okay, makes sense. Jimmy asks, thoughts on using newer or modern hops in traditional lagers?
Yeah, I love it. Like I said, either of these beers, Summerfest or Southern Gothic, do not use traditional hops or use some in combination with modern hops. I'm a big fan because, I really, like most brewers, I'm a hop head. I love hops, can't get enough hops. But that said, at the end of the day, I could go back to a beautiful Pilsner and drink it for the rest of the night. So I have a passion for quality Pilsners and Helles. But that said, I recently made a lager that used Laurel and Azacca, which are both newish domestic U.S. hops with a lot of myrcene in them and very interesting and very powerful aromatically. And it was pretty exciting. The result was like, wow, we could never enter this in anything because it wouldn't work in any category at all. But I really like it. It's damn good.
So does it have a name?
And no, it doesn't. It's one of our many audition beers that you'll find at our tap room.
Ah, okay. Another reason to go there when it opens.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jimmy. That was a good question. Eric has the next one. Follow up to, at what temperature do you measure mash pH of 5.2 to 5.5? Example, mash temperature of 150 at mash temperature at 153 F, measure pH at 153 F. At what time in the mash?
Yeah, correct. There's a pretty well known and understood impact of temperature on pH reading. I'm always under the opinion that as long as you're consistent, do the same every time, you're okay. There are a number of pH meters who will do the temperature correction for you. For that correction factor, you can look it up online. But generally, I will always measure temperature or pH at my rest temperature. And I'm doing that at my first rest. Even if I'm stepping or doing whatever during the course of the mash, I will always measure my temperature, my pH when I have established my first rest temperature, whatever that is. And the mash is mixed and homogeneous. That's when I'll take my measurement, and I won't look at it again until I start lautering.
So measure it the same way every time at the same temperature with the same equipment.
That's right.
All right, good question. Thomas has another one. How do you clarify your lagers?
Yeah, good question. In the case of Southern Gothic, well, we don't. It's unfiltered, and it's hazy as a result, as you can see.
I like it.
Yeah, it's definitely, I don't know if everybody has it, probably not, but if you can see it all, it's got a haze to it. For Pilsners and for lagers that I really want to have a brilliant and stable appearance, we do use PVPP, which is short, it's an acronym for polyvinyl polypyrrolidine. That is a very common worldwide industry standard beer stabilizer. And what that does is it will help pull out excessive polyphenols by bonding with them so that they can be removed during filtration. So in our beers, well, in a typical Pilsner beer, you have, a higher amount of hops. And so you're going to need more PVPP. In our beers, we use a lot of different malts and so on. So there's also some protein components in there that do form that chill haze. So we'll use silica gel blended with the PVPP. Silica gel as zero gel is what you would buy it as. And we use that at about a 70% PVPP to 30% silica gel as a stabilizer, not a filter aid, a stabilizer. So we'll dose that in to the tank or even in line, and it bonds together with the haze-forming compounds which are previously dissolved so that they come out of solution and precipitate. And only then can you remove them with filtration. So that's the key. You've got to identify these dissolved haze-forming compounds. They're proteins and polyphenols. And you can precipitate them with filter aids. Then you can remove them with filtration. So in a nutshell, that's how we do that.
Thomas has had a run of great questions. So Ernie has the next great question. Does Sierra Nevada use multiple strains of lager yeast based on the style of lager?
We do. The 3470 is our workhorse, and it's fairly versatile, but we've certainly used other strains in the past, and we will also in future when we've got specific beers that we want to that we really want the yeast to put their signature on. So Vienna might be a good example of that. Oktoberfest, we've used many different yeasts in the course of brewing Oktoberfest over the years. So the answer is yes. We're in the light.
A lot of expertise in the collabs, like Bitburger. Were multiple strains in that, or was that purely the Bitburger?
Well, the question was, do we use multiple strains of lager based on the style of lager, not necessarily mixed culture fermentations.
Okay. Yeah.
Mixed culture is a different deal entirely. But that's not unheard of either. In fact, one of the traditional techniques I don't really know if it's widely used even today, but for example, a lot of brewers will do a primary fermentation with yeast A, and then post filtration put in yeast B, for example, for various reasons, and so that's also done. But yeah, I'm a big fan of knowing your yeast and understanding what it will do when you change various parameters. And only then can you really steer it to the result that you're looking for in your beer. And also know that brewers do not make beer, you guys. I hate to break it to you. None of you make beer. You only make wort. The yeast is making the beer. And there are so many yeasts out there. All of them are vastly different and give so many different characters and options for you as brewers in your beers. So I would absolutely encourage you to experiment with lots of different strains.
All right. Next question comes from Jeff. Does the extra time in lagering actually improve the homebrew lager? For example, is 6 weeks always better than 4 weeks? Is 8 weeks always better than 6 weeks?
Great question. It kind of depends, but I would say in general, I would say a minimum of three weeks is what I would like to see. 4 weeks is better. 6 weeks is excessive. You might want to, for example, use a very long lagering time for a bock, or really strong beer where the flavors from fermentation as a result of high gravity worts. All of you will remember that when you have high gravity worts, you are going to experience higher alcohols, more aldehydes, and lots more off flavors. So therefore, you're going to need a long maturation time. But for a standard, say 12 Plato Pilsner or 11.5 Helles or something like that, 3 weeks is plenty. If you're making a Doppelbock, be patient.
So is that proportional with the alcohol? So if you had double the alcohol, you're 8.5, 9%, would you double the fermentation time?
I guess you could look at it like that. Try your beer. Just try it and get to know it. I never cease to be amazed after all these years brewing. One of my favorite things to do is to sample my fermenters. So I will sample them even on day one when fermentation has barely started, and I'll try them frequently because it's so fascinating how they change. Even when you're making, let's say, for example, you're making your Pilsner recipe and you're making it once a week, every week for years and years. And if you try them, you will start to see differences. And then you'll start putting two and two together. Oh, yeah, the air turned off for a few seconds on that one. Or I think the dead count on that pitch was a little high, or things like that. And you'll just be like, wow, this is crazy. How different it can be. But long story short, they change. The beers change so dramatically right before your eyes. If you try that on a frequency where you can appreciate the differences as it goes from fermentation to green beer and maturation and finally and so on. So yeah, I don't know. Try your beers, get to know your yeast, and experiment.
All right. So we're down to, Scott, about 1 minute each, or we're going to have a very unceremonious end. What I pay for is exactly 2 hours, and we're about 9 minutes away from that. So if you're ready for a lightning round, about 1 minute each.
Oh, okay. Do I need a buzzer? I need a buzzer.
Yeah, I'm not going to disappear on the screen, so I'm going to be watching my watch. All right. I'm going to try and keep this as short. It's really long from Adrian. Let's see, the importance on lager fermentation temperature. Brewlosophy guys have done many times, many experiments fermenting with 3470 at ale temperatures, and claim people cannot differentiate the difference between lagers fermented at ale versus lager temperatures. They claim it creates a good lager. It's obviously yeast dependent, with certain strains. Have you guys ever done or plan to do a lager like that? So experiments with 3470 at ale yeast temperatures.
Yeah, great question. I've taken that yeast all over the map in terms of temperatures, and we have this conversation with folks pretty regularly, in fact. And the conversation goes like this: well, if we change this or if we change that, do you think anybody will know, or can they tell the difference? And some people will go, maybe, and some people will go, probably not. Some people will go, definitely not. And so the odds are in favor, 2-1 of no, people aren't going to be able to tell the difference. But I can tell the difference. And if I don't like it, I'm not doing it.
That's the best answer. Good question, Adrian. I think you're on your own with that one. Tom, how come lactic versus phosphoric? What are the disadvantages of phosphoric? 1 minute.
Yeah, phosphoric is great for acidifying your sparge water. You need very little. It's very easy to come by, and it has nearly no flavor impacts. It's also not traditional. The phosphoric acid is the primary acidifying ingredient in a lot of sodas, and so a lot of us are familiar with how that works. Lactic is something you can do yourself. You can make it yourself. It is Reinheitsgebot. It's very traditional, and it also has a flavor component to it, which you cannot get in any other way. And I'm not saying that when you're acidifying with lactic, you are looking for that lactic character. These are flavors that are so sub-threshold that you couldn't pick them out. But in combination with everything else that's going on in that lager, it makes a difference.
So if you want to win a gold medal, you better use lactic.
I would, if you need to acidify at all. And if you're lucky enough to have beautiful water and you don't need to worry about it, then good on you.
All right. Good question, Tom. Gary has our next one. 1 minute. I want to get more grainy character in my Pilsner. I admire Pilsner Urquell for its graininess. Do I have to use a Moravian malt to do this?
No, the Moravian malt is a beautiful barley. It certainly has a distinctive character. It's very old world. But I would suggest that you do not need to use it. You can. But I think that what you need to do is a decoction. And you can do that with off-the-shelf domestic Pils malt and get a similar character. So decoction is the answer on that one, I would say.
Thank you, Gary. Next one comes from George. What is the method of extracting the lactic acid from acidified wort in these German breweries that are doing this method as Scott described?
There is no extraction. You just add the acidified wort as it is, and it's not particularly concentrated. Titratable acidity We refer to that as TA. Some people say it's total acid, but its titratable acidity is only 1.3 or something like that. So, it's not even close to the strength of vinegar. So you do need to add maybe more of it, but you use the wort. And when you do that, you also have to take into consideration the extract that wort contains that you're adding in as well, because it is unfermented. The lactic acid or bacteria won't reduce the sugar content of that wort at all. They'll just acidify it.
Okay, 4 minutes, and we have 4 questions, but we may not get to the last one, so we'll do these real quick. Why send back the beer due to foam? I think that's back to your question.
Yeah, that's funny because it's such an important characteristic in Pilsners in Germany that it would be like, oh man, I don't know. What's a really bad analogy?
Well, it's just
getting a burger without a bun or a hot dog with no mustard. What kind of crap is that? You're not going to put up with that. You want a good foam on your Pilsner. Doesn't have foam, there's something wrong with it, right?
I like that.
I don't mean to be crass. That's
Elliot, good question.
The expectation. That's the expectation.
Yep. Adrian asks, melanoidin versus decoction, is it worth flavor-wise?
Ooh, good question. Good question. So when we want to do a faux decoction, I will certainly use a little bit more melanoidin containing malts. So you're talking your Munichs, not your Viennas, your Munich type malts. Or you can even buy melanoidin malt. The differences between all those we don't have time for now, but I would say yes, that is a good trick to employ. I'm a big fan of doing that. It's not the same, but it can get you in the ballpark.
2 more questions. Eric says, does step mashing have benefits over single infusion?
I would say it does. I would really say it does. For example, with step mashing, you can target, let me say it in another way. You can realize better control over your attenuation limits because you can target very specifically your beta versus your alpha amylase. The proteinases is very rarely employed and generally not needed to be employed. Certainly, your beta glucanases and so on. Although I will say that for wheat beer brewers out there, I'm a big fan of a ferulic acid rest. So that's a different lecture. We might do that one some other day, Doug.
I'll hold you to that.
Big fan of that. But for Pilsner brewing, I really like a step mash because then you can you can really target those beta and alpha activities and get a more accurate attenuation, let's say.
All right. Thank you, Eric. One last question. It's a good one, but keep it short, Scott, because we're down to 90 seconds. Were you ever a home brewer?
Yes, for sure. And truth be told, I still am. I still do. I can't get enough. I've brewed all day, every day for more than 20 years professionally. And before that, home brewing since I was, I think my first home brew, I was 16. And my last home brew was 6 days ago.
Wow. So, I would have been against that.
Keep on keeping on.
We have 45 seconds left, and I just we've got bravo. Appreciate you doing this, Scott. Thank you. Wow. Bravo. Indeed. All kind of positive comments, and Scott, just can't thank you enough for doing this. We will have a hard stop in about 25 seconds. So maybe you want to close with something that's just really quick, maybe other than a cheers.
Well, thanks for having me again, Doug. Sorry it took me so long to get my shit together to be here with you and all of you. And I'm happy to do it So cheers and happy brewing.
Absolutely. Thank you, Scott.